Okay, so here's one more video I'm going to do here, and this is to explain the source of comparative advantage in the Heckscher-Ohlin or HO model. And so this is a different model than we had in chapter 3. And in this model, what we're going to assume is we now have two factors of production, and we have two goods that are going to be produced as before. So the goods are the same as before. Steel and bread is in chapter 3. We have two countries. This time I'm going to label them Chile and Argentina. We have two factors of production, capital and labor. And we can look at the factor endowments, or the number of units of each of these factors of production that the two countries have. And so to set this up here, I'm saying, let's say that Chile has 120 units of capital, which we'll use K to abbreviate for capital, because economists use C usually for cost, so we don't want to use C because that could be confusing. And Chile has 60 units of labor. Argentina, by contrast, has 60 units of capital and 120 units of labor. So in the terminology used in the HO model, what we'll say is Chile has abundant capital. And because their ratio of capital to labor is bigger than Argentina's ratio. Argentina's ratio is 1 unit of capital to 2 units of labor, 60 divided by 120. So Chile has a capital labor ratio, or the ratio of the two inputs, of 2. Argentina has a capital labor ratio of 1/2. So in that regard, we'll say that Chile is labor abundant. And then, when it comes to producing the goods, let's say that the formula that you'd use to produce steel requires that you use 2 units of capital and 1 unit of labor. If you combine 2 units of capital and 1 unit of labor, you get 1 unit of steel. The formula for producing bread would be 1 unit of capital and 2 units of labor, and then we get 1 unit of bread. So the capital labor ratio in the use of steel would be 2 to 1. The capital labor ratio in the production of bread would be 1/2. So in this regard, we'd say that the production of steel uses capital intensely. Now, the factor in the HO model, the country that is abundant in, I wrote labor. Why did I write labor there? Chile is capital abundant. The country that will have a natural comparative advantage in producing the good whose production intensely uses the factor of production that they are relatively abundant in. Now, since I've laid out the formulas here, we can illustrate this by saying, well, suppose Chile wants to produce steel and only steel. How much steel could Chile produce? Well, they need to take 2 units of capital and 1 unit of labor for each unit of steel. And you look at those ratios there. If they produce only steel, they can produce 60 units. Because they take 60 times 2, that's 120. 60 times 1, that gives us the 60. So they have enough capital and labor to produce 60 units of steel. But when it comes to bread, Chile, because bread uses 2 units of labor and 1 unit of capital, Chile is only going to be able to produce 30 units of bread. Because after producing 30 units of bread, they need 60 units of labor, and they've used up all of their labor producing bread, and then they've only used 30 units of capital, but you need to actually have some labor to go with capital to produce any steel. So in effect, Chile would have 90 units of capital that would be left over, couldn't use to produce anything if they produced all bread. So Chile would be able to produce 60 units of steel, 30 units of bread. And then Argentina, well, the numbers just flip around. In this case, Argentina could produce 60 units of bread if they produced all bread, because Argentina is abundant with labor. They have a lot of labor. So in this case, they could produce 60 units of labor. That they need 60 units of capital and 120 units of labor according to the formula, and that's exactly what they have. But if they wanted to try to produce steel, now Argentina is going to run out of they're going to run out of capital because they only have 60 units of capital. You need 2 units to produce every unit of steel. After they produce 30 units of steel, they're out of capital. And then they can't produce anything more. They have no capital left over. They have 30 units of steel, but they won't have produced any bread. So we could come down here and graph this on the axes here. So where we see Argentina can produce 60 and 30. So that's Argentina. And then Chile can produce 30 bread and then 60 steel. In the HO model, we use the BODE production possibilities curves. So what we do is we draw this in, and then this would look like Argentina's PPC. And then we draw in here, and here is Chile's PPC. And they would end up being bold in this fashion. But what we can see is that Argentina can produce a lot of bread, Chile can produce a lot of steel. And so that's how they sort of have this comparative advantage. Now, if you think about looking at how we defined comparative advantage, it was depending on the opportunity cost. With the BODE PPFs, it becomes a little complicated to think about defining that, because at different points along this production possibilities curve, then the opportunity cost is changing. So with a BODE PPF, the opportunity cost is always changing. So we can't quite define comparative advantage quite the way we would have before. But what we can see is that because Argentina, given their factor endowments, they have a lot of labor. You need more labor than capital to produce bread. So Argentina is labor abundant, and they can produce a lot of the good that intensely uses labor in its production. Chile is abundant in capital, has a bigger capital labor ratio than Argentina, and then we can see it has an ability to produce a lot of the good whose production requires a lot of steel. They can produce a lot of the good whose production is steel intensive. And that's really sort of like the whole point of the HO model. What the HO model really gives us here is a way to assess or think about where comparative advantage comes from. In the model in chapter 3, we just specify, who's got the comparative advantage in one good versus another. But that's sort of like completely made up. So this allows us to at least anchor that comparative advantage in some real-world considerations. So the relative abundance of the different factors of production, their ratios in the different goods in different countries, and then the intensity with which those factors of production get used in the production of the different goods in the economy. So a country has a natural comparative advantage in producing the goods, excuse me, the goods where that intensely use the factor of production that they have in great abundance. One thing that's true in the HO model, though we don't have to go through it in great detail here, is that because we have these BODE PPCs, the countries will not specialize completely. But they will sort of specialize. They will produce relatively more of the good whose production intensely uses the factor that they have in relative abundance. So we don't have complete specialization, but there is at least partial specialization, certainly more specialization than you would see in either country in their autarky equilibriums where they didn't trade at all. So we still have the principle of comparative advantage applying here, in that when Chile specializes and relatively speaking produces more steel than they would in autarky, and when Argentina produces more bread than they would in autarky, there are still gains to both countries from producing and from specializing and trading. So we still have the gains from trade between the countries in the HO model. But we get it in a little more complicated and in some sense realistic, or at least grounded in the real world way of linking comparative advantage to factor endowments and then the production technologies. So that's comparative advantage in the HO model.